Dowds here. I'm CEO of UKOM, and we are delighted to be one of the sponsors of the 2021 AOP Publisher Tech Talk. Under today's headline banner, "It's all about your data," we're going to explore the importance and value of publishers tagging their sites comprehensively in UKOM Ipsos Iris, the new, and for the next 5 years, UK industry standard for online audience measurement. With me, I am delighted, and on your behalf, I am relieved to say are three people far better qualified, far more engaging, and a damn sight more interesting than me on this topic. We have Tasneem Ali, one of the directors of audience measurement at Ipsos. We have Denise Turner, director of research and insight at Newsworks, and we have Amanda Wigington, formerly for 20 odd years director of insight at Time Inc. and TI Media, and now independent consultant for the PPA. I thank them all in advance for their input. Now, the primary reason that UKOM, with representation across the UK media industry, selected Ipsos Iris as the new standard for online audience measurement was its single source panel of 10,000 individuals covering about 25,000 devices, PC, tablet and smartphone. The methodology is a hybrid one, blending the robust source of truth that is that people panel with the granularity and richness of census data. That is the data generated by all visitors to the publisher's own sites and collected through tags on those sites, sections and pages. Now, it is worth saying that while there is much discussion about the demise of the third-party cookie, and UKOM are working with Ipsos and the wider industry to explore the implications and viable alternatives, there's still a hell of a lot of road to run on that issue. And in the meantime, the value of tagging is significant and can be immediately realised. So, without more ado, let me pass over to Tasneem Ali from Ipsos for an overview. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and a pleasure to be here. All right, so jumping into what is tagging. It's basically applying a short device-agnostic JavaScript tag onto the participating websites and an SDK on the apps. This basically allows us to capture all traffic that visits those websites and apps, which helps us accurately capture and report on page views and time spent, in addition to the granular device information. We consider tagging to be a really important part of our solution. And quickly touching upon its benefits, basically tagging ensures, number one, guaranteed reporting for tagged sites, specifically for smaller web properties that may be underrepresented by the user-centric panel. Basically, if you're tagged and we see at least one panelist coming through, we will report that website. However, if you're not tagged and you do not meet the minimum threshold of 20 panelists, it won't be reported. Number two, it allows the publishers to break out site sections and report them under specific content categories for more insightful and granular audience analysis. Number three, off-site audience measurement. So the likes of Google AMP and Facebook Instant Articles that also get reported if your sites are tagged. And finally, extending the reach of our user-centric panel from 25,000 to potentially millions of devices, making the data very, very robust. And with that, let me start with you, Wig, and get your perspective on why tagging is important for the magazines.
From my perspective, it's actually not about tagging at all. She says, just to be controversial right up front. For me, it's actually about use. So the way I think we've discovered as we've worked through the sort of tagging process on Ipsos Iris is actually you have to start with your use cases. So you need to know what you would like to do with the data. Now that's harder than it sounds because we were working within a framework where we hadn't seen the data before it actually launched. And I think what publishers are now working towards and focusing on is those use cases. And by use cases, what I mean is the primary use case currently has been for sales. So whether that's reach or engagement or whether it's been about proving your sort of value in a niche category or a passion area. But there are other use cases like content monetization, audience development, new product development and innovation. And actually starting from what you want to achieve actually informs how you need to tag. And that is why tagging is so important, really.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rick, for that perspective. And Denise, over to you. From news perspective, what role do you think tagging plays in usage, as Rick put it?
So Tasneem, I think one of the key things about digital measurement is almost going back to basics, because I think despite all the years we've had digital media, there's still a perception that it just happens, that it is, you know, it's automatically, you click your fingers and because it's digital, it must happen. But actually, there is a lot of preparation and planning that needs to go into measuring, you know, digital consumption, really. I read a really interesting blog last week, Jim Carroll, who's the ex-chairman of BBH, and he often goes and visits arts exhibitions, and he went to a Rodin exhibition, and I can't claim to be as artistically literate as him, but Rodin said something about planning and preparation are absolutely key, because the work that comes out at the end is so much better. And actually we shouldn't skimp on the planning and preparation time, because the results are so much better. And I think from a news brand perspective, there's so much variety of content, and it's the same for magazines, of course. News is not just hard news. News is lifestyle, it's inspiration, it's gardening, it's how to bake the best cake, all of that sort of stuff. So actually, if we want to really represent the best of what news brands can offer, then we need to do that planning and preparation. And it's not easy, but it's definitely worth the time and the effort put into it.
I think you've touched upon something really important, Denise, about planning and preparation. And from your perspective, knowing that the granular and the extensive categories that are available in our taxonomies, and the role that tagging plays in ensuring that the right content is categorized correctly, and therefore the reporting is done in a more robust fashion. How do you think the news industry or overall publishers have done so far on that?
Well, I think there's both an internal and an external that is going on, and still needs to happen, because, you know, as researchers, we know why it's important, but we need to do a bit of an internal marketing job as to why it's important. So I think that, and it's not an overnight fix. Again, back to my bit about digital media not being instantaneous. Digital measurement is also not instantaneous. I often talk about it as the illusion of precision, because actually you need to put that work and effort in. So I think it's an ongoing process. And also I think there's an element of, you know, maybe not money at risk, but I think Wig's point about use cases, about making sure that we are, you know, making the best possible use of the content and really putting those right numbers out there can only benefit the publishers. So I think it's work in progress, but there's definitely a job to be done in terms of making sure that we're, you know, keeping going with it, because it is really important to make sure that we represent published media in all its forms in the best possible light, and part of that is by making sure that we can measure what is being consumed, what's being read.
Denise, that's interesting. You talk about being able to go down to granular levels, because often the perception is that the news groups are selling on broad reach and the big headline numbers. But of course, even within the major news publishers, they have some relatively niche content servicing relatively niche sectors of audience, or you have for some of the bigger organizations either regional titles and then beneath regional titles within them, whether it's sport or local news and what have you. And I think it's important that the whole depth and breadth is seen, and news sells itself on the granularity as much as the big headline numbers.
Absolutely, because I think the scale is really important to demonstrate that news publishers do reach, you know, an enormous proportion of the population on a daily basis. And I think that's what's, you know, fantastic about Ipsos Iris. But also there are some people who will only be interested in certain passion points. I mean, I think that's a magazine phrase, isn't it, Wig? But there, you know, whether it's, I've talked about gardening, but, you know, I mean, I'm not interested in reading about sports cars, sorry, but I am interested in reading about, you know, what the latest baking recipes are, you know. And so I think it's really addressing, you're right, Ian, it's addressing both the breadth of reach, but also the depth that you can get by, you know, going into individual categories.
I guess that the magazines are more commonly out there selling on the niche, because even some of the single publications can be very, very specialized. But does that come across in the way that the magazine industry sees itself, and the importance of tagging in this, in both its own audience insight and taking it to market?
Yes, definitely. I completely agree with actually all of what Denise said there, but I think the important thing is one size doesn't fit all. So to your point about some of the brands are really specifically specialists. So that influences how they then tag, and the need to go and the need of going granularly, as she says, with that tag as well. So
in a granular manner.
In a granular manner, yeah, it didn't work, that, did it? but I think that's the key. And I think what publishers, particularly magazine publishers, is we've now got a holistic view of all of those passions, and we can see what tagging's working and what tagging's not. And I think not only does one size fit all, so I think it's almost going to be impossible to get every single publisher to the same level, and actually we shouldn't expect that. But what we can now see is what's working and what's not working. And we can identify areas where we can improve and sort of deepen that tagging even further to the benefit. And because ultimately this is all about driving value, isn't it, for us all? And I think Iris was a new launch in the market, and a lot of the data now is giving us the ammunition to grow it forward. So I'm one of those people that thinks that we're going to be forever just tagging. I sound like a broken record to the PPA members, but I think it's just never going to stop. It will just continue to evolve and change based on what your business need and use cases actually.
So on that, Vic, I mean, that's a really interesting point on business case and driving usage. So there are two particular use cases. Well, not only two, but two main areas how Iris data can be used, which is driven by tagging. The first one is more the external perspective, you know, your sales conversations with agencies, how you sell your audiences, and really showcase the value of your property and the audiences that you drive externally. And then there's a bit about internal usage. So whether it's editorial, content generation, marketing strategy, so on and so forth. And from your perspective, how do you think tagging granularly where it makes sense? So if you're reaching, it's an overall lifestyle magazine, for example, and it'll have many different segments under it, so it might make sense to tag granularly. So if you take that example, how do you think tagging helps publishers use the data more from that perspective, internally and externally focused?
So I actually think the use cases are far more granular than internal and external, and that's why tagging is so important. So I think in terms of the external use cases, so you were talking about the commercial sales story there, the big reach and the numbers. I think for publishers, it goes down to, I'm trying to prove reach, or I'm trying to prove engagement, or I own this category. I mean, for want of a better expression, that's the specific use cases. So I think all of those publishers, and it is really mixed, that started out with that clarity about what they wanted to prove. The tagging framework is the planning and preparation point, Denise, that you made actually. Those that had that framework have managed to sort of push that successfully in market and see the return. I think where it's more challenging is on the internal use cases. So there are a number of other tools that publishers use to measure internal performance. There are also a number of KPIs that are set up. And what a number of the magazine publishers are currently doing at the moment is reviewing those KPIs and looking at how Ipsos Iris can obviously help achieve those KPIs and drive audience growth or inform a content monetization strategy. So I think it's much slower there, because I think people initially looked at Ipsos Iris as that sales tool. I think a key benefit, particularly for magazine publishers, is also where it feeds into PAMCO as well, so that you can get a total brand reach across print and digital. And I think that has been the priority focus. There are now magazine publishers that are looking at that second internal side, but it's new to businesses. So the use cases, I go back to the use cases because it's all about how you're going to use the data, become vitally important.
Do you think there is a growing attention being paid to the value of attention and engagement to content? Because obviously one of the key benefits of tagging is more accurate calculation of time spent within certain pages or sections of a website or app. Do you see that as becoming more of a critical sell for quality publishers?
It's definitely one of those areas where publishers can then compete in the digital marketplace by demonstrating the amount of time spent with content. We've been a bit I don't know what the word is, wrongly educated over the last number of years that we all have short attention spans. You know, famously we're meant to have the attention span of less than a goldfish, 8 seconds or something. But actually, you know, quality publishers, people are spending a lot of time with that content. They're reading it, they're, you know, digesting it. And particularly over the last 18 months, I think, as we've, you know, gone through the pandemic, people have been turning to published media for the why behind the what, you know, and what does all this mean for me, and how do I cope both mentally and physically during these, you know, tricky times. So being able to demonstrate on a, you know, really regular basis that time spent is, you know, much higher than people would expect, and we don't have those short attention spans, is really vital, I think, for the published media industry.
I think I can just add to that while we do some certain analysis to come up with insight pieces, what I can attest to that, Denise, is that we're actually seeing a lot more specific sections of, you know, a publisher's website, for example, which might have a smaller audience, but a very high engaged audience. So you might see, you know, maybe it's not in the grand scheme of things a really large audience, but they're spending significantly large amount of time consuming that content, and you can see that engagement and that profile come through. So absolutely, that, you know, we do sometimes think that in today's economy our attention spans are not as high, but I think where consumers want to be engaged, we do see through the data that the engagement levels can be very high.
Yeah, it's a choice thing, isn't it? You know, we're not just sort of flitting from one thing to the other all the time. We choose to give our attention to a piece of content, and I think no more so than in published media. You know, whether that's in news publishers or magazines, we choose to give our attention because we've actively engaged with the content. We've not just sort of come across it by accident.
I think that's also where the category side of Ipsos Iris is actually so crucial, because that provides a real opportunity, particularly for specialist magazine publishers, to really deepen and drill down. And that's both from an internal perspective in terms of, you know, getting the data that they potentially only had on their own sites from internal analytics systems on the wider market, but also externally in terms of where they rank, how they position. And that it sort of builds on from that attention and engagement story, because at a category level, that is vital. And from magazines publishers' perspective, that is their sort of niche and USP, because it's about people's passion. So that's where tagging and categorization becomes absolutely vital and essential.
We often hear people, less informed publishers, say we've got plenty of data on that on our own internal analytics. And you know, it's one of the things we're continually stressing is your own analytics are great, but they're very, very rarely deduped across device to the level that Ipsos Iris does it. And your own internal analytics are great, but what it doesn't do is allow you to benchmark yourself against your competition, who have their own set of internal analytics. And it's absolutely critical that people understand that the more granular you go, the more granular you tag, the more you get to see as a publisher how you stack up against how your competition, and how some competition that you didn't even know was out there might be out there in certain categories. And it just gives you a much more firm compass of how to navigate the broader industry, as opposed to just what's happening within your own mini walled garden.
I mean,
I think
if I was back client side now, that would be extremely powerful, particularly if you then overlay monetization and revenue on top of that granularity, so that you see the link between audience and revenue generation. And I think it's a phased approach, and I think that's where publishers are now starting to look for opportunity.
I think it's interesting, Ian, that you use the word compass, because I often talk about the concept of triangulation, the geography concept, where you use different points to work out where you are and where you're getting to. And I think no one source of data will tell you the entire truth, but having several different sources that sort of corroborate the story is absolutely super important. And your own internal data is absolutely vitally important for helping you with your internal planning, but having that sort of industry view is a layer on top of that that's absolutely vital as well. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, it's interesting. People often expect, because we're an industry standard, that we should be saying, ignore every other bit of data, the only thing that matters is what we say. And that couldn't be further from the truth. We're absolutely very aware that data is not a zero-sum game, and there are multiple points of data, but at some point you need to have a level playing field on which everybody compares themselves equally to everybody else. And if your competitors have started to tag down to a granular level, they're going to have the advantage as they go to market and as they understand their own audiences that you're not going to have. And this is the one true level playing field where you can create your own advantage by going down into that level of granularity.
I think that's a really important point that you've touched upon, Ian, is the level of granularity and what your competition and the rest of the market is doing as well. So while absolutely I agree with everyone that the usage will drive your tagging strategy, so to speak, it is really important to also keep in mind how are your competitive set tagging, what level of granularity are they showing to market, and how are those audiences showing up in ranking, in category reports. When agencies start using the data, how will they see the data, and how will the ranking of those specific niche audiences show up, and are you included in those rankings as well?
I think you make a great point there, and I think that's a good one to wrap up on. So thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope that's made some sense, and I hope that's encouraged you all to pick up on the tagging with Ipsos Iris. A massive thanks to Denise and Wig for taking the time to give their perspective, and all the best for the AOP and for the rest of the week. Thanks very much all.